1963. And they were discussing the 1964 election. They knew they were going to have to carry two big states in the South to guarantee their election. They needed two states with the most electoral votes. So they selected Florida and Texas. Texas was a natural because Vice President Johnson was from Texas. So beginning on November 18th, or actually on the 16th, the President went down to Palm Beach. From there he went to Cape Canaveral, to Tampa, to Miami, to campaign in Florida. Came back to the White House, and then on Thursday, November 21st, we left from the White House by helicopter, flew to Andrews Air Force Base to begin the trip to Texas. Flew down, went to San Antonio first, where the President made a speech at the Brooks Air Force Base Aerospace Medical Center that was being dedicated that day. There were thousands of people at the airport, on top of the terminal, inside the terminal, pressed against the glass. No matter where we went, there were thousands of people who turned out. Here we're going through the streets of San Antonio. The President had decided to stop the motorcade and allow some of the people to rush forward to get a closer view and to shake his hand. Something we didn't like, but something he wanted to have. This is a crowd as we went from San Antonio over to Houston. We were going to Houston, into downtown Houston. This is the motorcade into downtown Houston. See, we were on an expressway. The traffic's all been stopped in both directions. People are lining the expressway to view the President as we traveled into the downtown section of Houston. We got to the Rice Hotel. There was a LULAC convention going on. It's a Spanish-speaking group, and Mrs. Kennedy spoke to them in Spanish. The President was just pleased as could be with the results. We then went from there over to the Coliseum, where they were having a good celebration and a tribute to the local congressman who had brought the Space Center to Houston. His name was Thomas. From Houston, we flew over to Carswell Air Force Base near Fort Worth. We arrived there about 11:05 at night. It was raining lightly, but there were thousands of people at the airport, many with small children. And I looked out the window of the aircraft as we taxied in, and I thought, why would people bring their small children up on a rainy night like this, 11:05 at night, to witness an arrival ceremony? And then I realized I was pretty jaded because I was around the President all the time, and all these people knew this was their one chance for their children and themselves to see a President of the United States. It didn't happen every day. So here we are, trying to get into the hotel in Fort Worth. You'll see here's the President. Here's the Vice President. There's Agent Youngblood. That's myself right there.
There were about 4,000 or 5,000
people outside the hotel as we tried to get through the crowd and get into the hotel, get them up to their rooms so they could be in for the night.
So that was the first day.
That was November 21st, Thursday. It was a long day.
But it was really successful politically.
It was very successful. The crowds were larger than anticipated. They were extremely friendly. There was really no negativity at all. And the first family, both President and Mrs. Kennedy, and I believe Vice President Mrs. Johnson, the Governor, Mrs. Connolly, were very pleased with how that day went.
So you wake up on November 22nd in Fort Worth.
In Fort Worth. There was going to be breakfast in the hotel. There was room in the breakfast for 2,500 people. But they had many, many more people who wanted to see the President. So they had to add an additional stop, and that was a speech outside the hotel in a parking lot. So President Kennedy and Vice President Johnson went out to that speech site. There were thousands of people there. They were banging out of windows all over the place in a light rain. And he spoke to this crowd of about 5,000, I guess. And they were very pleased that he was there. And then he came into the hotel to attend this breakfast. It was well received. Now, when he went out to make a speech in the parking lot, I went to the presidential suite to stand by for Mrs. Kennedy. She had given me her schedule. I knew exactly what to expect. On her schedule, she made a notation. She said, JBK won't attend the breakfast. So I'm in the suite with Mrs. Kennedy. Phone rang. It was the agent with the president down at the breakfast. He said, Clint, he said, President wanted Mrs. Kennedy to come down right away. I said, Bill, I said, President, Mrs. Kennedy's not planning to come to the breakfast. He said, you didn't get the message. The president wants Mrs. Kennedy down here right away. I said, I've got the message, we'll be right down. And so I went in, explained it to Mrs. Kennedy, and brought her down to the breakfast. When we got to the breakfast room, opened the door, walked in, 25 people just jumped to their feet, screamed, hollered, and cheered as Mrs. Kennedy entered this breakfast.
And then you had quite the same reception as you were going through the streets of Fort Worth as you were heading out back to the airport.
When we left the Texas Hotel to go back to Carmel Air Force Base to get on Air Force One, thousands and thousands of people had turned out along the parade route. The schools had closed. They had put their high school bands at the intersections as we passed by. So it was really an enthusiastic and extremely friendly as we drove out to Air Force One.
So now you're going to fly on Air Force One from Fort Worth to Dallas, which if any of you have ever been in that area, you know that's quite a short distance. I don't know of too many people who would fly from Fort Worth to Dallas. Why did you fly instead of driving?
Well, it was kind of ridiculous because, like you say, when we took off, we almost immediately began to descend for the landing spot at Love Field. But the political people wanted a photograph of President and Mrs. Kennedy coming off the rear of Air Force One in Dallas. And so that's what they got. President and Mrs. Kennedy came off the rear of Air Force One here to be greeted by this reception committee. You'll see Vice President Johnson here, Mrs. Johnson. They had just seen him 10 minutes before in Fort Worth. But they were part of the reception committee. And so when we got off, the President noticed this big crowd behind a fence. So immediately he turned to that crowd and walked toward them. Mrs. Kennedy normally wouldn't have done that. But because she wanted to support him, she went right along, shook hands all the way along the fence line as we worked that fence trying to get them to get into the car to join the motorcade going into Dallas. We were going to the Trademark, which was the speech site for a luncheon speech by President Kennedy. Along the way, the crowds were light to medium, but they built as we went into the city of Dallas. By the time we got to Main Street in downtown Dallas, the crowd were so large they could not be contained on the sidewalks. They were in the streets. There were people hanging out of windows, people in balconies. Every place that they could find to witness this motorcade, they did. And it was friendly, enthusiastic, very welcoming, and everybody was very pleased at the reception that they were receiving. Now, the crowd was so large that on occasion, the driver would keep the car farther to the left than to the right, and I would get up on the back of the presidential vehicle to be as close to Mrs. Kennedy as possible to preclude anything from happening, because the driver would keep the car farther to the left, as you see here, close to the crowd, giving the president more space between himself and the people on the right. So that's why I'm up on the car. And so I would get up and back, and as the crowd dispersed, I'd go back to the follow-up car. But this happened 4 or 5 times as we transferred down the street there in Dallas. And we were coming down Main Street. Now, there's a lot of conspiracy things. One of them is, well, why did it go right on Houston instead of going straight down Main Street? Well, I can tell you why. There's this little thing here called a berm that we would have had to have gone over. And a presidential car couldn't do that. And so we had to go right on Houston, left on Elm, in order to get to the Stemmons Freeway, to go in the correct direction to get to the Trademark.
And that's quite a sharp turn there, going onto Elm Street.
This turn right here is very sharp, which means the cars had to slow way down. So we were going very slow as we rounded that corner there between Houston and Al. Here you see the follow-up car crew. That's myself right there. Another Agent McIntyre, Agent Reedy, and Agent Landis. Two other agents in the back of the car, Agent Hickey and Agent Barnett. Hickey had a rifle. And two members of the President's staff were in the car, Kenny O'Donnell and Dave Powell. So we were moving down Elm Street, going toward a triple underpass. I'm on the left-hand side, I'm scanning to the left, and all of a sudden I hear this explosive noise over my right shoulder. So I immediately started to turn toward the noise. And as I did, I was going across the back of the presidential car visually, and I saw what happened. I saw the president grab at his throat. He started to move to his left. And I knew something was wrong, so I jumped. And I ran toward the presidential vehicle with the intention of getting up on top of the back to form a shield or a barrier there so no further damage could be done. When I jumped off, I had to get between the car and a motorcycle that was right next to us. I learned later that there had been a second shot fired while I was running. I didn't even hear it. But as I approached the presidential vehicle, there was a third shot. I not only heard it, but I felt it, because it hit the president in the head. And as it exited, it became such a powerful exit that it caused an eruption of brain matter and bone fragments and blood from the president's skull. Went all over the rear of the car, all over me, all over Mrs. Kennedy. And at that point, I'm almost getting up on the car, and she came up on the trunk. She was coming up on the trunk trying to grasp some of the material that came out of the president's head. She was trying to grab that in her hands. I got a hold of her and I put her in the back seat. When I got her into the back seat, the president's body fell to its left, with his head in her lap. Right side of his face was up. I could see his eyes were fixed. I could see the hole in the skull. I could see through that hole that there was a great deal of brain matter gone from that general area there. I thought it was a fatal wound. I turned and gave a thumbs down to the follow-up car crew to let them know how serious it was. Screamed at the driver to get us to a hospital. And so he hit the gas, and we went forward toward what turned out to be Parkland Hospital.
I want you to notice this is the position Clint was in as he got up on the back of the car. There were 3 shots. He didn't know there were only going to be 3 shots. He assumed more shots were coming, and you can understand the reason he's in that position. He was trying to save the occupants of that car. Now, it took him much longer to tell you this story than the amount of time it actually happened. We're going to show you now the Zapruder film in real time. It's been edited slightly. The fatal headshot frame has been edited out because it's very gruesome, and the man who took the film thought that that should never be seen by anyone. So let's go ahead and roll the film.
We're coming down up Houston, and we're going to turn onto Elm. And the outriders are out. Here comes the presidential vehicle. About now, the president gets hit for the first time, and then he moves to his left, and the fatal shot is fired that hits him in the head. And I come up on the trunk, trying to get Mrs. Kennedy back into the rear of the car. And so that's how long it took.
Less than 6 seconds. And so you race to Parkland Hospital. Takes about 4 minutes. You're spread-eagled up on the back of the car, going 80 miles an hour down the freeway, praying to God you're going to get there in time. You arrive at Parkland Hospital. Now this photo was taken about 20 minutes later. When you got there, there wasn't anybody outside of the hospital.
There was nobody there when we arrived, and when we pulled up at the hospital, the other agents jumped off the follow-up car and ran forward. Agent who was in the right front seat of the follow-up car was a guy named Emory Roberts, who was very experienced, and he was the senior supervisor, and he ran up and he looked at the condition of President Kennedy. He turned and he said, "I'm taking my men to Johnson," because he knew that the president was completely incapacitated. That we had to guarantee the continuation of government, and he took the vice president and they took it into the hospital to secure him in another room. Now, the first thing we had to do, the agents that were with me, they had to try to get the president out of the car. We had to first move the governor. He had been shot also. So he was seated right in front of the president in what we call the jump seat. So we lifted him up finally, got him on a gurney. Mrs. Connolly accompanied me into the emergency room. Then we were going to move the president. But Mrs. Kennedy had a hold of him, and she wouldn't let go. I pleaded with her. I said, please, Mrs. Kennedy, let us help the president. Didn't get any response. I pleaded with her again. Nothing. So then I realized the problem was she didn't want anybody to see the condition he was in because it was horrible. So I took off my suit coat, covered up his head, his upper back. As soon as I did that, she let go. We lifted him up, put him on a gurney. We raced into the emergency room, put him in trauma room 1. Doctors started to arrive from all over the hospital. At one time, I counted 17. They did everything they could trying to revive him.
And then you had to notify the White House what was going on here in Texas.
Yes, I was told to contact the White House, let everybody back there know what's going on. So I got the telephone operator to put me through to the White House, told him to keep the line open. I was talking to my boss, Darrell Bain, when the operator cut in and said, Mr. Hill, the Attorney General wants to talk to you. Well, the Attorney General was Robert Kennedy, the President's brother. And so I said, okay. So I said, yes, Mr. Attorney General. He said, what's going on down there, Clint? So I explained that the President had been shot, the Governor had been shot, we're at the emergency room at Parkland Hospital. The doctors are working on him. He said, well, how bad is it? Well, I did not want to tell Robert Kennedy that his brother was dead. So I just said it's as bad as it could get. And when I said that, he just hung up the phone, and that's how we found out what happened.
So inside the hospital, it's chaos as the agents are trying to secure everything. They're trying to keep the press out. The press is outside trying to figure out what was going on because most of them were in vehicles well behind the presidential vehicle. They knew something had gone terribly wrong. They're trying to gather information. And people at home, if you had been home that day, if you were a housewife, you might have been watching As the World Turns, as many people were, and this is how America found out what had happened.
Yes, that's right. Hey, it's a little early for that, ain't it? Coming along?
Here is a bulletin from CBS News. In Dallas, Texas, 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade in downtown Dallas. The first reports say that President Kennedy has been seriously wounded by this shooting. More details just arrived. President Kennedy shot today just as his motorcade left downtown Dallas. Mrs. Kennedy jumped up and grabbed Mr. Kennedy. She called, "Oh no," the motorcade sped on. United Press says that the wounds for President Kennedy perhaps could be fatal. Repeating, President Kennedy has been shot by a would-be assassin in Dallas, Texas. Stay tuned to CBS News for further details. This is Walter Braungart in our newsroom, and there has been an attempt, as perhaps you know now, on the life of President Kennedy. He was wounded in an automobile driving from Dallas Airport into downtown Dallas, along with Governor Connolly of Texas. They've been taken to Parkland Hospital there, where their condition is as yet unknown. We have not been told their condition. At Dallas, in a downtown hotel room, a group has been gathered to hear President Kennedy when he's waiting his arrival. Let's switch down there now, where Eddie Barker of KRLD is on the air.
As you can imagine, there are many stories that are coming in now as to the actual condition of the president. One is that he is dead. This cannot be confirmed. Another is that Governor Connolly is in the operating room. This we have not confirmed.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago.
even 50 years later, it's still so shocking and unbelievable to hear Walter Cronkite say that. So Clint, you didn't know any of that was going on. You were still in the hospital dealing with the tragedy as it's unfolding. What's happening now inside Parkland Hospital?
Well, at 1 o'clock, the doctor came out of the trauma room and said, there's nothing more we can do. President is dead. Kenny O'Donnell was the top aide there, and he came to me and he said, Clint, he said, we're going to need a casket to transport the president's body back to Washington. Can you arrange for that? And I said, certainly. So I contacted the hospital administrator, because I didn't know anything about Dallas, and he helped in getting hold of O'Neill Mortuary, and we arranged for a casket to be brought to the hospital. I signed for it, put the casket into the emergency room in trauma room 1. They prepared the body to be placed in the casket. We were all ready to go when the officials in Texas said, wait a minute, you can't leave. You can't take the body out of the hospital until there's been an autopsy. It's a state law that says an autopsy must be performed on a homicide victim before it can be released. We said, well, this is the President of the United States, President of all people. We want to take him back to the nation's capital. They can do the autopsy there. They said, no, state law says you have to have the autopsy here. And that discussion went on for a while, became a little bit heated. We finally said, we're leaving anyway. And they said, well, if that's the case, then please have a medical professional accompany the body through the entire process. Now, I volunteered Admiral George Berkeley, who was there, who is the President's personal physician, an admiral in the Navy, and he then remained with the body. So the body was brought out, the casket was brought out to the ambulance, the hearse rather, placed in the back of the hearse. Admiral Berkeley got in the back, brought up Mrs. Kennedy, said we could ride in this car right back here. She said, no, I'm going to ride in the back of the hearse with the president. I said, okay, so opened the door, put her in the back with the casket. I got in with her. So there we were on our way to Love Field, the president, the casket, Admiral Berkeley, Mrs. Kennedy, and me all in the back of the hearse. We got out to Love Field. We offloaded the casket, the agents and myself, and we started to carry it up the rear ramp to Air Force One. The crew had removed a number of seats in the back of the aircraft so that we'd have a place to put the casket. None of us thought about measuring the casket or the doorway. We got up to the doorway and discovered with the handles attached, the casket was a little bit too wide to go through the door. So we broke the handles off the casket. We got it into the rear of Air Force One and set it down. Mrs. Kennedy then came aboard, and she was seated in an area right adjacent to the casket. Vice President Mrs. Johnson had been brought to Air Force One prior to our arrival, and we're waiting there for Mrs. Kennedy to come with the President's body so that they would all fly in the same aircraft back to Washington. Then we learned that we couldn't leave immediately because President Johnson had been conferring with some people in Washington, and the decision had been made that he needed to be sworn in while we're still on the ground in Dallas. That required a federal judge. We didn't have one with us. They had to locate one. So they located Sarah Hughes, who was a local resident there in Dallas and who recently had been appointed a federal judge. They brought her on board. So just before the swearing in was to take place, I was in the forward portion of the aircraft. Mrs. Kennedy had sent word that she wanted to see me. So I got up and walked through the presidential compartment back to where she was seated. I said, yes, Mrs. Kennedy. She stood up, she grabbed my hand. She said, oh, Mr. Hill, what's going to happen to you now? She was concerned about me. She knew that the administrations were changed, and she didn't know what was going to happen, and she was concerned. It was very difficult for me to realize that she thought enough of me to think about that at that time because of what she was going through. But then I said, I'll be okay, Mrs. Kennedy. I'll be okay. And so I went then forward, and they began the swearing-in ceremony. President Johnson asked that she stand with him. She wanted to do that to make sure people knew that the government the change in administration was one that she was participating in, and Vice President Johnson was sworn in.
And so then you were on that long, somber ride back to Washington. Here you can see Clint and the other agents offloading the casket. Robert Kennedy is there. He had come to greet Mrs. Kennedy. And then you proceeded to Bethesda Naval Hospital for the autopsy, staying overnight there while the autopsy was performed. Finally getting back to the White House early that morning.
Yeah, we left there about 3:40 in the morning to get back to the White House around 4 o'clock. And when we got there, the military met us. They provided the body bearers and a military escort, carried the president's body into the East Room there in the White House, where it was placed on a catapult identical to the one that had been used for Abraham Lincoln in 1865.
And what time did you end up going home? You've now been awake for about 24 hours.
I stayed up when I found out they left the East Room and went up to the second floor. I stayed out around until 6 o'clock. Then I drove home, changed clothes, shaved and showered, had a little bit to eat, and came right back to work because there was nobody to replace us.
All of the other agents are now with President Johnson, but there are 2 agents with Mrs. Kennedy, and they still have a job to do with nobody else, no other shifts. So that next day, you have to prepare for the funeral.
Yes, Mrs. Kennedy said that she wanted to go to Arlington National Cemetery to pick out a grave site. So I took her and Robert Kennedy and 2 of the president's sisters, Pat and Jean, out to Arlington National Cemetery where they met with Secretary McNamara, and they picked out the grave site for the president.
And at this point, of course, the news has spread around the world, and for all intents and purposes, the world stopped. Everything stopped for 4 days. Games were canceled. Doctors closed their offices. Stores closed. People are just in complete shock, grieving as a nation and as a world because this president was beloved around the world.
Then we had, on the 24th, we had a private mass in the East Room of the White House for staff and friends and family. Then now President and Mrs. Johnson came to the White House to pick up Mrs. Kennedy and the children and to accompany the President's casket up to the U.S. Capitol. And you see them here standing in the front of the White House, Mrs. Kennedy, Caroline, John. And we moved on down Pennsylvania Avenue to the United States Capitol, where the President's casket was taken up to the rotunda and placed in state in the United States Capitol.
And I know when you tell me about that day, there's something that just sticks in your mind when you think about that day.
When we drove down the street, there were hundreds of thousands of people that had come to Washington that were lining the streets. But it was absolute silence. There were only 2 sounds that you could hear. Clip-clop of the horse's feet pulling the caisson, bearing the casket, and the ruffled drums of the military as they marched down Pennsylvania Avenue.
So then you come out of the Capitol, and this is the sight you see.
Hundreds of thousands of people had gathered outside the Capitol with the opportunity to walk past the casket. Now the idea was to allow that to happen that day, the 24th, and then they would close it off around midnight, I guess, and prepare for the next day. But there were so many thousands of people that they couldn't close it. They had to keep it open all night. And at 9 o'clock that next morning, the morning of the 25th, they had to close it because we were about to come up to take the casket past the White House to St. Matthew's for the funeral services, which meant thousands of people who still wanted to pass by did not have the opportunity. But nothing like that could be done.
So now more than 100 heads of state have flown in from around the world. This is a photograph of them standing in front of the White House, getting ready to meet the caisson as it's going to be transported then to St. Matthew's.
Yes, Mrs. Kennedy had decided she wanted to walk from the White House to St. Matthew's Cathedral behind the caisson. Tried to talk her out of it, but she insisted. See Mrs. Kennedy, Teddy Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Sergeant Schreiber, her brother-in-law, Steve Smith, her half-brother, Jamie Auchincloss. This is myself. This is Agent Bill Livingston, who became the head of Sergeant Armstrong of the U.S. Congress, who was Youngblood. Here's President Johnson, Mrs. Johnson, Lucy, Linda. There's Jerry Kivett, who became the special agent in charge of the Secret Service office here in Atlanta.
So the president has been assassinated, and now you're walking through the streets of Washington, hundreds of thousands of people around, 100 heads of state. It had to have been a security nightmare.
It was a security nightmare. Everybody was on edge. And we called out every possible assistant of military assistance that we could. This car right here is a car bearing Carolina John, Agent O'Leary, Agent Meredith. But here you'll see Charles de Gaulle, King Baudouin, Haile Selassie. All these heads of state, all around the world, came here to pay their respects.
So then the services were held in St. Matthew's, and who can forget this image of little John saluting his father? But you have a story behind that salute that not many people know.
As we came out of the cathedral, they placed the casket on the caisson out front. Mrs. Kennedy and the family lined up. I'm standing here. Mrs. Kennedy leaned over and whispered something to John, because she noticed that all the military were saluting the president's casket. And so John turned, threw his shoulders back, and he saluted. Well, it just didn't happen. What happened was, in early November, late October, Mrs. Kennedy came to me and said, Mr. Hill, the president is going to go to Arlington National Cemetery on November 11th. He's going to lay a wreath at the Tomb of the Unknowns. And I'd like to have John accompany him. And I know the military is going to be there and pay their respects to the Commander-in-Chief. I'd like to have John learn how to salute so he can also pay his respect to his father. Do you think you can do that? I said, no problem. We'll teach him how to salute. So I got the agents that were working with him every day. I told them what she wanted. I told them what they had to do. So they started working with him and teach him how to salute. Well, trouble was he'd only do it with his left hand. He would not use his right hand. Well, come the day, November 11th, the agents took him out to Arlington to be with his father. They were scared to death because they knew he was all left-handed. But when the time for the salute came, John apparently noticed all the military saluted with their right hand. And so he did it correctly. Everybody was relieved this could be. So the day of the funeral, during the funeral services, he got a little rambunctious. Mrs. Kennedy turned around and said, "Can the agents take John out?" So the agents came, they took him to a little room off the side of the sanctuary. And they were trying to figure out what to do and keep him busy. So they thought, well, we'll have to practice his salute. So they did. He's right back to doing it all left-handed. There was a Marine colonel standing in the doorway. He saw what was going on. He's shaking his head. He walked into that room. He said, "John," he said, he came to attention, he said, "This is how you salute," and he showed him. I'll be damned. It took that colonel about 10 seconds to teach him what we've been trying to teach him for a month. He was successful in moving on. So that's how John learned how to salute. Here you see the massive crowds that were around the Lake Memorial and across Memorial Bridge on the way to Arlington National Cemetery. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people. They're about to fold the flag here and present it to Mrs. Kennedy. And then we, after the funeral services that day, went back to the White House where there was a large reception for all the heads of state. And then Mrs. Kennedy told me that she wanted to go back to the cemetery that night, privately. She wanted to go and see the eternal flame and pay her respects. And so, sometime after 11 o'clock that night, she called and said it was time she wanted to go. And she and Robert Kennedy came down. We got him in the car. She brought a little bouquet of flowers. We drove out to the cemetery. Only the sentry was there, and they had the chance to go to the gravesite, kneel and pray, and pay their respects.
Well, Clint, you said that when you were a young boy, you always wanted to be a history teacher. I think you have become a remarkable history teacher. Thank you.